The sterile white walls of the military hospital reflected the quiet hum of morning activity. In the surgical prep room, Dr. Victoria Ramirez stood motionless, her dark eyes focused on the sterile surgical instruments laid before her. She had been assigned to this base in Moscow for 3 months now, always a temporary replacement, never fully integrated into the team. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Today, the life of a soldier depended on her. Her hands, steady and practiced, moved with precision as she checked the chart. A man named Sergei Ivanov, 45 years old, a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, had been brought in with what the attending called routine gallbladder inflammation. But something in the patient's file caught her attention: his deployment history, his elevated markers, the pattern of symptoms. She'd seen it before. In the field hospitals under fire, far from the comfort of civilized medicine, where every decision could mean life or death. She adjusted her surgical mask and made a mental note. This was not a routine case. As she began to prep for the procedure, she felt the weight of the eyes on her. She knew the whispers, the skepticism. A civilian surgeon with a questionable past. No one knew her true history, and she planned to keep it that way. She didn't need their approval. What she needed was focus, precision, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. The last time she'd operated in a situation like this, there had been no room for error, and this soldier's life depended on her ability to trust her instincts. But as she sterilized her hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls she had carefully built to protect her identity were beginning to crack. One of the nurses, Captain Olga Mikhailova, a seasoned field medic, looked up from the patient's chart. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating. "Doctor, you requested additional tests. Why?" "Deployment conditions affect presentation," Victoria replied without hesitation, her tone professional. "Infections, environmental factors, things that wouldn't show up in a typical civilian case." Mikhailova didn't respond immediately, but her gaze lingered on Victoria's face. For a moment, the silence between them was charged, as if the nurse was trying to place something she couldn't quite define. "Understood, doctor," Mikhailova finally said, her voice steady. But the brief exchange left Victoria uneasy. She wasn't hiding, she was surviving. But for how long? With a sigh, she turned to leave the prep room. The hospital was busy, filled with the sound of nurses and doctors, soldiers and civilians, all part of a complex system that she had once sworn loyalty to. But now her loyalty was to the patient in front of her, and as the doors to the operating room swung open, Victoria was ready. Ready to confront the unexpected, ready to challenge the doubts of those around her. It was time to perform surgery, not just on Sergei Ivanov, but on the parts of herself she'd buried long ago. She stepped into the room, taking her position at the table, and for a fleeting moment, her past felt like a distant echo, one that she could ignore, if only for a few hours. But as the first incision was made, she realized something. No one here knew who she really was, not yet, and she was determined to keep it that way. The operating room was dimly lit, the harsh overhead lights casting long shadows over the surgical field. Victoria Ramirez stood over the patient, her hands steady as she examined the incision. Everything had been going smoothly, until now. As she worked, she kept her focus on the patient's vital signs, but a nagging feeling persisted in the back of her mind. There was something wrong, something more than the typical gallbladder inflammation. The tissue wasn't responding as expected. She paused, lifting the scalpel and glancing at the assistant next to her. "Prepare for deeper exploration," she ordered, her voice calm but commanding. The assistant hesitated for a moment but complied, moving quickly to fetch the necessary tools. As the operation continued, Victoria found herself questioning her instincts. The pattern was too familiar. It reminded her of cases she'd treated in the field, under conditions far less controlled, in places where there was no room for error and no time to waste. Places where lives depended on her ability to make the right call in the blink of an eye. And in those moments, she had always relied on her combat-trained instincts. This patient's condition didn't match the standard medical diagnosis. It couldn't. Victoria's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Deployment history, unexplained fevers, a timeline that didn't add up. She had seen this before: contaminated water, untreated wounds, infections that spread like wildfire. But in a civilian hospital, those conditions didn't fit the usual protocols. She had learned the hard way that sometimes the textbook answers weren't enough. "Dr. Ramirez, you seem concerned." Captain Mikhailova's voice cut through her thoughts, a note of concern in her tone. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She focused on the patient's abdomen, her fingers moving delicately through the layers of tissue. The subtle changes she had felt earlier were now unmistakable. The infection wasn't localized to the gallbladder. It had spread. Necrotizing fasciitis. The words formed in her mind like a cold truth. If this was what she suspected, the surgery would need to change direction immediately. She looked up at Mikhailova, meeting her eyes with steady resolve. "This isn't a simple gallbladder issue. The infection has spread through multiple fascial planes. We need to act fast." Mikhailova's expression shifted from concern to professionalism. Without a word, she passed the necessary equipment. Victoria's hands moved rapidly, cutting away dead tissue, working with a speed that matched the urgency of the situation. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The surgery was no longer routine, it was a race against time. Outside the operating room, the hospital continued its daily rhythm. But inside, the stakes had suddenly been raised. The door to the operating room swung open, and Dr. Thornton entered. The chief surgeon's presence was commanding, his every step measured. "Dr. Ramirez, we've got a full schedule today. What's going on here?" His gaze swept across the surgical field, his eyes narrowing as he took in the unfamiliar approach. "We need more time," Victoria said, her voice steady, though the adrenaline coursing through her veins betrayed no sign of hesitation. "I'm dealing with necrotizing fasciitis. If we close now, this patient will die." Thornton paused, his eyes flicking to Mikhailova, who nodded in agreement. He didn't say anything for a moment, his professional demeanor masking the momentary uncertainty that flickered behind his gaze. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low but intense. Victoria met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm sure." She didn't need his approval. She knew what needed to be done, and she would do it, even if it meant standing alone in the operating room. She had been trained for moments like this, moments where life and death hung in the balance, where the only thing that mattered was saving the patient. "Then keep going," Thornton finally said, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. As he stepped back, Victoria refocused on the patient, the weight of his life in her hands. Time was running out, but there was no room for error. Every movement was precise, calculated, and despite the chaos that surrounded her, Victoria knew one thing for sure. This was where she was meant to be. Not as a temporary replacement, not as someone trying to hide from her past, but as a surgeon who had been tested in the field and knew what it took to save a life when everything seemed impossible. "We need additional debridement tools and large-volume irrigation," Victoria said, her voice calm despite the rising tension. Mikhailova nodded, quickly gathering the equipment. The team worked in sync, responding to her commands with the kind of efficiency that only comes from trust. Trust that Victoria had earned, even without anyone fully understanding the depth of her experience. The surgical field became a battlefield. The infection spread, but Victoria's hands were steady, her focus unwavering. She knew what she was doing. And no matter how much they underestimated her, she was going to prove them all wrong. As the minutes ticked by, Victoria's heart rate remained steady, her focus absolute. She had been through too much to be shaken now, and when the patient's vitals finally stabilized, she allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but only a brief one. This battle wasn't over yet. The hours after the surgery passed in a blur. Victoria found herself back in the surgical lounge, alone for the moment, as the rest of the staff moved about, preparing for the next round of procedures. The adrenaline had faded, but the weight of what had just transpired remained. She had saved Sergei Ivanov, no thanks to the assumptions of her colleagues. But the truth was, she didn't need their approval. She needed the patient's survival, and that was all that mattered. Yet there was something unsettling about the way the staff now treated her. Their eyes followed her movements with a mixture of curiosity and doubt, as if they were waiting for her to slip up. She was the outsider, the temporary replacement who had done the unthinkable, performed surgery that most of them wouldn't have attempted, and succeeded. The door to the lounge opened, and Dr. Thornton stepped in, his presence as imposing as ever. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dr. Ramirez, we need to talk." Victoria stood up, her posture straightening instinctively. She had known this moment would come, the moment when her past would catch up with her. "About the surgery?" she asked, her voice calm, though her pulse quickened. Thornton shook his head. "No, not about the surgery." He hesitated for a moment, and Victoria saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, respect, she couldn't be sure, but it didn't matter. "This morning," Thornton began, "you saved that man's life. Not just by performing the procedure, but by making the right call in a high-risk situation. I've been practicing for over 20 years, and I've never seen anyone diagnose necrotizing fasciitis that quickly. You handled that situation like a combat surgeon." Victoria stiffened. "I'm just thorough," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. But Thornton wasn't buying it. "De Ramirez, I've worked with a lot of surgeons and I've seen many different styles. But what I saw today was something else. I don't know who you really are, but I'm starting to get the feeling that there's a lot more to you than what's in your file." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She had kept her past buried for a reason, and now it was starting to resurface. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Thornton didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I'm going to find out, whether you want me to or not." Victoria's mind raced. She had been so careful to avoid detection, to keep her identity hidden, but now it seemed as though Thornton was piecing together the fragments of her past, and there was no way to stop him. "You're still the best surgeon I've ever worked with," Thornton added, his voice softer now. "But this situation is getting more complicated by the minute. Whatever you're hiding, it's not just affecting you, it's affecting everyone around you." Victoria felt a rush of anger, but she held it back. She had spent years running from the past, and now it was catching up with her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. "I'll keep doing my job, Dr. Thornton," she said, her voice steady. "If that's good enough for you." Thornton didn't respond immediately, but Victoria could tell that he wasn't satisfied with her answer. The tension in the room was palpable, and she could feel his gaze lingering on her as he left the lounge. She had dodged a bullet for now, but she knew it wouldn't be the last time Thornton would push. She had learned to survive in environments where everything depended on keeping your head down, avoiding scrutiny. But here, I guess in this sterile world of civilian medicine, the rules were different. People noticed, people questioned, and eventually those questions would catch up with her. Victoria stood by the window, looking out at the sprawling hospital grounds. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the landscape. It was beautiful in its own way, but she couldn't afford to let the beauty of the moment distract her. The past had a way of creeping up on you when you least expected it. And this time, she wasn't sure how much longer she could outrun it. As she turned away from the window, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Captain Mikhailova. "Patient stable. Vital signs normal. You did good today, Dr. Ramirez." Victoria smiled faintly, but the weight of the message didn't settle the storm brewing inside her. For a brief moment, she wondered if there was a way to simply disappear again. But she knew better than that. Disappearing wasn't an option anymore. She had made her choice the moment she walked into this hospital, the moment she decided to keep doing what she had been trained to do. And now, there was no turning back. The door to the lounge opened again, and this time, it was Captain Mikhailova who entered. "Dr. Ramirez," she said, her voice quieter now, but with an edge of curiosity. "There's something we need to talk about." Victoria's stomach tightened. She had been expecting this conversation too, but she hadn't thought it would come so soon. She looked up at Mikhailova, her gaze steady. "What is it?" Mikhailova hesitated for a moment before responding. "I know who you are." Victoria's heart stopped. The walls she had so carefully built to protect her identity were starting to crumble, and this time she wasn't sure if she could rebuild them. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the panic she felt inside. Mikhailova stepped closer, her eyes searching Victoria's face. "I saw the way you moved today, the way you handled that patient's complications. It was military field surgery. I recognize the techniques because I've seen them before, in the field, under fire. You were trained by someone who knows how to survive when it matters." Victoria's mind raced. How much did Mikhailova know? How much had she guessed? For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Mikhailova spoke again, her voice softer now. "I'm not going to report you, but you need to know this isn't just about your skills. It's about the fact that you're hiding something. And at some point, that's going to catch up with you." Victoria's breath caught in her chest. She had been so careful to bury her past, but now it seemed as though the truth was starting to seep through the cracks. The walls were coming down, piece by piece. And this time, she wasn't sure if she could stop it. Victoria's hands clenched into fists, the old surge of panic rushing through her veins. She had spent years keeping her past buried, using her skills to save lives and her identity to stay out of sight. But now it was becoming impossible to keep the two worlds separate. Captain Mikhailova's words echoed in her mind. "At some point, that's going to catch up with you." Victoria turned away, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The last thing she needed was to let her emotions slip. She had learned that lesson the hard way. Control was everything. She had built a career in civilian medicine on a foundation of lies, but those lies had kept her alive. And now it seemed that every step she took to protect herself was only leading her closer to a reckoning. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "but I suggest we focus on the patient." Mikhailova didn't respond immediately. Victoria could feel the weight of her gaze on her back, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. But when Mikhailova finally spoke, her tone had shifted. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "You're hiding, trying to bury the past." Victoria didn't answer. She couldn't. She had been hiding for so long. She wasn't sure she even knew how to stop anymore. But she wasn't about to let Mikhailova, someone who barely knew her, tell her what to do. "I'm here to help," Victoria said, her voice firm, with the authority she had honed in the field. "That's all that matters." Mikhailova looked as if she were about to argue, but then something changed in her expression. She sighed, as if she had made a decision. "I'm not going to press you," she said, her voice softening. "But you need to understand something. People around here notice, and not just the medical staff. The military liaison, Colonel Davis, he's been watching you too. And the moment someone starts asking questions about you, it'll be too late." Victoria's stomach twisted. She knew the name, Colonel James Davis, the same man who had handled all her military assignments when she was still Captain Victoria Ramirez. The man who would recognize her in an instant if he ever saw her face again. Her heart thudded in her chest as she turned to Mikhailova, keeping her expression as neutral as possible. "If anyone asks," Victoria said carefully, "you don't know anything. You're a good soldier, Captain. That's what matters." Mikhailova nodded slowly, her eyes studying Victoria with a mixture of concern and something else, something that felt almost like a sympathy. "Just be careful, Doctor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This game you're playing, it's dangerous." As Mikhailova left, Victoria's mind raced. She had always known this day would come, the day when her past would catch up with her. But she hadn't expected it to happen so soon, so completely. She hadn't expected Mikhailova to see through the carefully constructed persona she had built for herself. And she certainly hadn't expected Thornton or Davis to start noticing either. She was a ghost here, drifting in and out of this hospital, always the outsider, always the temporary replacement. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that being the outsider was the only way she could survive. And yet, now that survival was beginning to feel like a prison, she had made choices to get to this point, and those choices had kept her safe. But in the end, they were starting to cost her more than she was willing to pay. The door to the lounge opened again, and this time it was Dr. Thornton. His expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "Dr. Ramirez, we need to talk." Victoria stood, her body automatically straightening at the command in his voice. She didn't want to face him, not now, not after what had just happened with Mikhailova. But there was no escaping it. She followed Thornton down the hallway, her mind already bracing for whatever questions he had for her. When they reached his office, Thornton gestured for her to take a seat. "You know," he began, "I've been thinking about today's surgery. The way you handled that case, it's unusual." Victoria sat, but she didn't answer immediately. She knew what he was getting at. She had taken a routine gallbladder procedure and turned it into a high-stakes life-or-death battle. She had deviated from the plan, just like she had been trained to do when there was no other option. But in this hospital, deviation wasn't just a technical decision. It was a matter of reputation. "I'm just thorough," she said, her voice calm but firm. Thornton studied her for a moment before continuing. "That's what I thought at first. But the more I look at your work, the more I realize there's something more going on. Your technique, your approach. They're not from a civilian program. They're from somewhere else. Somewhere I can't quite place." Victoria felt a chill run through her, but she kept her expression neutral. "I study extensively," she said, deflecting. "I read surgical journals, international methods. It's not uncommon for a surgeon to be influenced by different techniques." Thornton nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as if he didn't fully buy her explanation. "You've got a lot of skills, Dr. Ramirez, skills that don't come from a typical background, and I need to know who you are, not just as a surgeon, but as a person." Victoria's chest tightened. She had been waiting for this. Thornton wasn't going to drop the matter. He would keep pushing, just like he had in the operating room. And the longer she stayed here, the harder it would be to keep hiding. "I'm just trying to do my job," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. "That's all." Thornton didn't respond right away, but his expression softened slightly. "I'm not trying to make things difficult for you, Dr. Ramirez," he said, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "But there's more going on here than just a medical case, and sooner or later we're going to have to confront it." Victoria nodded slowly, her mind racing. She knew exactly what he meant. She could only hide for so long before the truth came out. But for now, she had one option: keep doing her job, keep saving lives, and hope that her past stayed buried just a little longer. The door to Thornton's office opened again, this time with a new voice. Colonel Davis stood in the doorway, his gaze sharp as he looked from Thornton to Victoria. "Dr. Ramirez," he said, his voice curt, "I need to speak with you." Victoria stood, her body rigid with the unspoken weight of the moment. Colonel Davis was no stranger to her past. He had been the one who had signed off on her dishonorable discharge years ago. The same man who had ordered her to leave the field hospital and never look back. His arrival now, in Thornton's office, felt like the final piece of the puzzle snapping into place. Thornton looked between them, his eyes narrowing as the tension grew thicker in the room. "Dr. Ramirez," Davis said again, his voice cold, the words clipped with military precision. "I need to speak with you." Victoria took a breath, trying to steady herself. She had faced enemies on foreign soil, had made life-or-death decisions under fire, but nothing had ever felt as dangerous as this moment. She nodded, signaling to Thornton that she was ready to face whatever came next. "I'm listening, Colonel," she said, keeping her voice steady, though inside, her pulse hammered in her ears. Davis didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I've been reviewing your file," he said, his words deliberate, almost calculated. "It's not what it should be. I want to know who you really are." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She had prepared for this. She had expected it. But hearing those words so directly was different from everything she had imagined. "I told you who I am," she replied, her voice low but firm. "I'm Dr. Victoria Ramirez. I work here." Davis's gaze remained fixed on her, his eyes sharp, as if he could see through the layers she had carefully built. "No, Dr. Ramirez," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of military command. "You're not just Dr. Ramirez. I know you. You were Captain Victoria Ramirez, a Navy SEAL combat surgeon, and you disappeared. You disappeared after Kandahar." Victoria's breath caught, her stomach tightening in a way she had never allowed herself to feel in years. Kandahar. The name alone was enough to bring the flood of memories crashing back. The decisions, the consequences, the lives lost. The dishonorable discharge that had sealed her fate and forced her to bury the woman she had once been. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria said, her voice betraying none of the panic that threatened to rise in her chest. "I'm not Captain Ramirez anymore. I'm Dr. Ramirez, and that's all you need to know." Davis didn't flinch. He had heard this all before, stories, lies, excuses, but now he wasn't about to let her hide behind them any longer. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You can't keep running from your past, Dr. Ramirez," he said quietly. "I know why you left. I know what happened in Kandahar, and I know the truth." Thornton remained silent, his gaze shifting between Davis and Victoria, as if waiting for something to break. Victoria stood her ground, but inside her mind was racing. She had been running for so long, and now it seemed there was nowhere left to hide. "I didn't have a choice," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think I wanted to leave everything I built? To walk away from my team, from my career?" Her eyes met Davis's, the raw honesty in them making his expression falter for just a moment. "I saved lives, Colonel, and I paid the price for it." The words hung in the air between them, the weight of them carrying more than just the story of one woman's sacrifice. It was a story of an entire system that had failed her, that had failed all of them. Davis stared at her for a long time, his gaze hard but not without understanding. "You were a hero, Ramirez," he said, his voice softening slightly. "You're still a hero, but you can't keep hiding from what you did, what we all did." The room fell silent as Victoria struggled to contain the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent years believing she was the only one who carried the weight of Kandahar, the only one who had sacrificed everything for the sake of the mission. But here, in this room, surrounded by these men, these soldiers, she realized that she was not alone. Davis took a step back, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not here to punish you," he said finally. "But we need you back. The Navy needs you back." Victoria blinked, caught off guard by the words. "Back," she echoed, her voice hoarse. "I'm not going back. That chapter of my life is over." Davis's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "Not if I have a say in it." Thornton, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "Victoria," he said, his voice measured, "I don't know what your past holds, but I know what I've seen today. And I need someone with your skill set on my team. This hospital needs someone who understands how to handle the most complex cases under pressure. You're that person." Victoria felt a flicker of something inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could still have a place in this world. But the walls she had built were still there, still standing tall, and they wouldn't come down so easily. She looked at Davis, her expression resolute. "I'm not going back to the Navy, Colonel. I'm not the same person I was." Davis nodded slowly, as if he had expected that response. "Then maybe it's time to create something new." He turned to Thornton. "I'm offering you Dr. Ramirez, here, the opportunity to rebuild her career, not as a soldier, but as a leader, to take her skills and integrate them into something greater, a program that brings military medical training into the civilian world." Thornton's eyes flicked between Davis and Victoria, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What kind of program?" he asked, his voice skeptical. Davis's lips twitched slightly, as if he had anticipated the question. "A national program," he said, "one that bridges the gap between military and civilian medicine, one that trains the next generation of surgeons to think like combat medics, to work under fire, to save lives when the system is broken." Victoria's mind raced as the weight of his words settled in. She could see it now, the program, the change, the chance to redefine what it meant to be a surgeon, to be a leader. "You're serious about this," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Davis nodded, his expression unwavering. "We all are." Victoria stood in the quiet of the hospital corridor, the weight of Colonel Davis's offer still hanging in the air. She had expected to be asked to return to the Navy, but not like this. Not with the possibility of a future that could redeem everything she had lost. It was a tempting offer, one that could give her the chance to make a real difference in a world she had thought she could never return to. But at what cost? She had walked away from that life for a reason. And now the very people she had tried to escape were offering her a chance to come back, under different circumstances, but still the same system, the same weight of responsibility, the same pressure to sacrifice everything for the greater good. "You're thinking too much," Mikhailova's voice broke through her thoughts, bringing her back to the present. Victoria turned to see the nurse standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, eyes watchful. "You don't know me," Victoria said, her voice clipped, defensive. Mikhailova didn't flinch. "I know more than you think." There was a pause, and then Mikhailova stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her. I've seen people like you before, the ones who bury everything, the ones who try to outrun their past. Victoria's breath caught, but she didn't answer. She couldn't, because everything Mikhailova was saying was true. She had spent the last few years trying to outrun her past, trying to outrun the guilt, the shame, the burden of making impossible choices in places where survival depended on breaking the rules. But here, in the sterile confines of this civilian hospital, she had found a kind of peace, a peace she hadn't realized she needed until now. "You think I'm hiding," Victoria said quietly, "but I'm just trying to do my job." Mikhailova nodded, her gaze steady. "And you're good at it. But hiding isn't a solution, you know that." Victoria's eyes hardened. "I don't need a lecture." Mikhailova raised her hands in mock surrender. "I'm not lecturing you, I'm just telling you the truth. You're good at what you do, but you can't keep running from who you are." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She had built walls around herself for so long, walls that no one had been able to break through. But Mikhailova was different. There was something in her eyes, something that made Victoria realize that maybe she wasn't the only one who had been hiding. "You're right," Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not ready to face it." Mikhailova didn't respond immediately. She simply watched Victoria for a moment, as if weighing something in her mind. "Maybe you never will be," she said softly. "But the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to bury it." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment all Victoria could do was stare at the nurse, a mixture of gratitude and frustration welling up inside her. She didn't want to hear it, but she knew it was true. The past wasn't something you could outrun forever. At some point, you had to face it, and that moment was coming faster than she was prepared for. "You've been through things I can't even imagine," Mikhailova added, her voice quiet but full of understanding. "But you're not the only one with a past. We all have something." Victoria met her gaze, surprised by the softness in the nurse's tone. It was the first time anyone had said anything that made her feel less alone in this, less like the ghost she had worked so hard to become. The moment was interrupted by the sudden blare of an emergency alert over the intercom. "Code red, multiple GSWs incoming." The tone of the announcement was sharp, urgent. "All available surgical staff report to ER immediately." Without a word, both women moved instinctively toward the emergency department, the weight of the conversation forgotten for the moment. The world outside the hospital was always waiting, always in chaos, and there was no time to dwell on the things that couldn't be fixed. As they walked through the sterile corridors, the intensity of the situation set in. Nurses and doctors moved with purpose, their faces etched with concentration as they prepared for the incoming casualties. Victoria's mind shifted automatically into professional mode. There was no room for hesitation now, no room for the past. She was a surgeon, and there were lives to save. The doors to the ER swung open, and the team sprang into action. Victoria quickly assessed the incoming patients, 3 men in tactical gear, all with severe gunshot wounds. The adrenaline kicked in, pushing everything else to the back of her mind. The first patient was already being wheeled into a trauma bay. "Dr. Ramirez," a medic called out, his voice urgent. "Lieutenant Commander Steele, left thorax, tension pneumothorax, BP 90-60. Victoria moved quickly to the trauma bay, her mind racing through the procedure in an instant. "Intubation, chest tube kit ready. Prepare for needle decompression if needed," she barked, her hands moving with practiced precision. The team worked in sync, with Victoria at the center of it all, directing the chaos around her. It was as if the world outside had disappeared. There was only the patient and the race to save his life. The monitors beeped with an incessant rhythm as Victoria guided the team through the procedure. The tension in the room was palpable, but she was calm, focused. She had done this hundreds of times before. But as she placed the chest tube, something stopped her, a flash of recognition. The face of the patient, unconscious on the table, was hauntingly familiar. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Steele. The same man she had saved in Kandahar. The same man who had been the reason for her discharge. The reason she had left everything behind. Victoria's breath caught in her throat, but there was no time to process the flood of emotions that rose inside her. The patient needed her. She pushed the thoughts aside and focused, one breath at a time, one movement at a time. And I need to stabilize him, she said, her voice firm. We're not losing anyone today. As the team worked around her, Victoria's mind raced. She couldn't afford to be distracted. Not now, but somewhere deep inside, she knew that everything was about to change. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next. Victoria's hands worked automatically, her training taking over as the patient's condition stabilized. She had been through this before, too many times to count, but this time, the weight of the situation was different. She could feel it in the air, the way the team moved with a mix of urgency and hesitation. They didn't know her, not like this. They didn't know the real Victoria Ramirez. They didn't know what she had done, what she had sacrificed, and the life she had tried to bury. But Marcus Steele did. The man lying unconscious before her, the SEAL she had saved years ago, knew exactly who she was. And now he was lying on her operating table, a living reminder of the past she had tried to outrun. The ER was chaotic, but in this moment, time seemed to stretch. There was only the hum of the machines, the soft beep of the monitors, and the steady rhythm of Victoria's breath as she focused on the task at hand. She could feel the eyes of the medical team on her, their judgment hanging in the air, but she didn't let it affect her. She couldn't. Lives were at stake. As the chest tube was placed, Victoria gave the signal to start compressions. Vitals are holding, the nurse called, but her voice was tinged with uncertainty. Oxygen saturation is rising. Victoria nodded, her gaze fixed on Marcus's face. There was something surreal about this moment, as though the entire world had narrowed down to this one room, to this one patient. Her mind flashed back to Kandahar, to the day she had operated on him for the first time. The memories were painful, but she couldn't afford to dwell on them now. She had to stay in the present, had to focus on saving him. "How is he?" Captain Mikhailova's voice broke through her thoughts. Victoria looked up to find the nurse standing beside her, her face unreadable. Victoria's hands tightened around the sterile drapes. "He's stable for now," she said, her voice steady. "But he's not out of the woods yet." Mikhailova nodded, but there was something else in her eyes now. Understanding, or perhaps sympathy. It was hard to tell. The two women had always kept their distance, but something was shifting. Victoria had always kept her emotions locked away, buried beneath layers of professionalism and distance. But Mikhailova was different. She wasn't fooled by the walls Victoria had built. The door to the trauma bay opened again, and another medic stepped in, his face grim. "Dr. Ramirez," he said, his tone urgent, "we need you in the ICU. Steele's blood pressure's dropping again." Victoria didn't hesitate. She dropped the surgical gloves into the trash and moved swiftly toward the door, Mikhailova following close behind. The ICU was already in chaos when they arrived, the patient's vitals dropping by the second. The surgical team was already working to stabilize him, but it was clear that this wasn't a simple fix. Victoria took a deep breath, her mind racing through the possibilities. She had saved him once, and now she had to do it again. She wouldn't let him die. She couldn't. The team worked in unison, following her commands without question. Every movement was purposeful, every action a step towards stabilizing Steele's condition. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't textbook, but it was working. Slowly, his blood pressure began to climb. His heart rate started to stabilize, and as the monitors beeped with the steady rhythm of life, Victoria allowed herself a brief moment of relief. But that relief was short-lived. The door to the ICU swung open, and a familiar figure stepped in. Colonel Davis. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene, before locking onto Victoria. "How is he?" Davis's voice was sharp, commanding. Victoria met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Stable for now," she said. "We're not out of the woods yet." Davis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "I want to know what's going on," he said quietly. "You're not just a civilian surgeon. You're someone who's seen combat. Someone who's been on the front lines." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. She had spent years running from the truth, burying her past in the hope that it would stay hidden. But now, with Steele's life hanging in the balance, it was becoming harder to ignore. "I've seen things," she said, her voice low. "Things that most people can't even imagine. But that doesn't matter now." Davis stepped back, his expression softening slightly. "It matters more than you think," he said. "The Navy has been searching for you. They need you back. The medical community needs someone like you, someone who understands how to save lives when everything's falling apart." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. The words were like a punch to the gut. She had spent years convincing herself that she was done with that life. Done with the Navy, done with combat, but now the truth was inescapable. She couldn't keep running forever. Not from her past, not from the person she had once been. "You don't know what you're asking," Victoria said quietly. "I can't go back." Davis didn't respond, but his eyes remained fixed on her. "We're offering you a chance," he said. "A chance to make a difference on a bigger scale. A chance to create something that will change the way we think about combat medicine." Victoria felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. She had always known that this day would come, the day when her past would catch up with her. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. "I can't go back to that life," she repeated, her voice hoarse. "I'm not that person anymore." But Davis wasn't giving up. He moved closer, his expression serious. "You never stopped being that person, Victoria. You just don't know it yet." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Victoria's resolve faltered. She had spent so long running, so long hiding behind a false identity. But now in this sterile hospital room, with the sound of Steele's stabilizing heartbeat in the background, she realized something. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to face the truth. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady now. Davis smiled slightly, as if he had been waiting for her to ask that question. "I want you to come back," he said simply, "to help us rebuild, to show us what combat medicine really looks like. And when you're ready, you can decide what comes next." Victoria felt the weight of his words, the gravity of the decision she was about to make. For so long, she had convinced herself that she could keep her past buried. But now, with the offer of redemption on the table, she had to decide if she was ready to face the consequences of that past, and if she was ready to return to a world that had shaped her, for better or worse. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice quiet. Davis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Take all the time you need," he said, "but know this, whether you come back to the Navy or not, you've already made a difference. And that's more than most people can say." As he turned to leave, Victoria stood still, her mind racing with the enormity of the decision in front of her. The past she had tried so hard to forget, the life she had left behind, was calling her back. And for the first time in years, she didn't know if she was strong enough to resist. The days following Davis's offer felt like a blur to Victoria. Her mind was constantly occupied by the weight of the decision she had to make. She had spent so long hiding from her past, burying the woman she had once been. But now her past was demanding to be faced, and the path forward was unclear. Every time she stepped into the hospital, it was like stepping into a battlefield where lives were in her hands and time was always against her. Yet despite the chaos of the medical world around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The truth had a way of emerging when you least expected it. Her phone buzzed on the counter in the break room. It was a text from Mikhailova. "Steele's awake. He's asking for you." The message sent a wave of unease through Victoria. Steele, the man who had unknowingly shattered the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. She had saved him once in Kandahar, and now she was saving him again, under completely different circumstances. She couldn't deny that the encounter would stir memories, too many memories. But duty was duty, and there was no time to second-guess herself. She had made a choice when she entered the operating room all those years ago. Save lives. That was her mission, and that was what she was still doing, whether she liked it or not. She grabbed her coat and headed toward the ICU, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. When she entered the ICU, the sight of Marcus Steele lying in the bed, his face pale and drawn, stopped her in her tracks. It felt as if no time had passed since Kandahar. The same intensity, the same strength in his eyes, even as he lay unconscious, fighting for his life. She walked up to his bedside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Steele," she said softly. His eyes fluttered open, his gaze focusing on her. The confusion in his eyes shifted to recognition. "Doc?" His voice was raspy, weak from the trauma, but it still carried the same intensity. You're still here." Victoria nodded, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'm still here," she said quietly. Steele reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I should have known it was you," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have known you'd be the one to save me again." Victoria squeezed his hand gently, her throat tightening. "I'm just doing my job, Steele." His eyes softened, the pain in his face evident, but there was something else there too, a deep, unspoken understanding. "You're not just doing your job," he said quietly. "You're saving lives. You've always done that." The words hit Victoria harder than she expected. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged what she had done, what she had sacrificed. "You saved me in Kandahar," Steele continued, his voice faint, "and now you're here, saving me again. I owe you everything." Victoria felt the weight of his words. She had never expected gratitude, never sought it out. She had always operated in the shadows, doing the work others didn't see, the work that saved lives but came with its own set of sacrifices. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice steady but laced with the emotion she was trying so hard to hide. Steele's gaze never wavered. "You think I don't know what you did, the risks you took. You gave up everything for us, for me, and now you're hiding in a civilian hospital, trying to bury yourself. I see you, Doc, and I'm not going to let you hide anymore." The words hit her like a punch. It was as if Steele could see straight through her, to the woman she had once been, to the woman she had tried so hard to forget. She had buried that part of herself so deeply, but here, in this moment, surrounded by the weight of her decisions, it was impossible to ignore. She had saved his life twice now, once in Kandahar and now in the ICU. But in the process, she realized something. She couldn't keep running from her past. Not anymore. "I'm not hiding," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "But I'm not ready to go back. Not yet." Steele gave her a look, as if trying to understand, but then nodded slowly. "I get it," he said softly. "But when you're ready, we'll be here. You've earned the right to decide what comes next. Don't forget that." The weight of his words settled heavily on her heart. She had spent so long convinced that her past would define her. But Steele, in his own quiet way, had just reminded her that she still had a choice. For the first time in a long while, Victoria allowed herself a breath of relief. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. As she stood by his bed, watching him drift back to sleep, she felt something shift inside her. The decision that had been weighing on her mind was no longer about hiding or running. It was about facing the truth and finding a way to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she was becoming. Outside the ICU, she found Colonel Davis waiting. His expression was unreadable, but there was an undeniable sense of anticipation in his eyes. "How is he?" Davis asked, his voice low. "Stable," Victoria replied, her tone steady. "He's going to make it." Davis nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've done good work here, Dr. Ramirez, but you know the offer still stands." Victoria met his gaze, her mind racing. She had no answers yet, no clear path forward, but she couldn't deny that a part of her was starting to wonder if maybe it was time to stop hiding. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice firm. "But for now, I've got work to do." Davis studied her for a moment, as if searching for something in her eyes. "I'll be waiting, Dr. Ramirez, when you're ready." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway, feeling a new sense of uncertainty begin to take root. Victoria knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy. But maybe, just maybe, it would finally be worth it. Victoria stood alone in the hallway, her mind still reeling from the conversation with Steele. His words had stirred something inside her that she had kept buried for so long. It was a feeling she had tried to suppress, guilt, regret, and the longing for redemption. But now, as the echoes of the past started to surface, she realized that she couldn't keep running, not anymore. She had spent too many years in the shadows, too many years hiding from the woman she had once been, and now, with each passing day, the walls she had built to protect herself were starting to crumble. She couldn't do this alone anymore. She didn't want to. The hospital was quieter now, the hustle of the day slowing as the night shift took over. Victoria found herself walking toward the nurses' station where Mikhailova stood, reviewing charts. Her gaze flicked up as Victoria approached, but she said nothing. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Victoria knew what Mikhailova was waiting for. She could feel the weight of her questions hanging in the air. "What's next, Doc?" Mikhailova asked, her voice quiet but full of meaning. Victoria took a deep breath, her mind working through the possibilities. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm still figuring it out." Mikhailova nodded slowly, her eyes searching Victoria's face. "You've got a lot of weight on your shoulders, but you don't have to carry it alone." Victoria met her gaze, feeling the truth of those words settle in. She had been so focused on surviving, so focused on staying hidden, that she had forgotten the importance of connection. The people around her, Mikhailova, Thornton, even Davis, they weren't just colleagues. They were potential allies in this fight for her future. And she had spent too long shutting them out. "I'm tired of hiding," Victoria admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm tired of pretending I'm someone I'm not." Mikhailova didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her expression softening. "Then stop pretending," she said gently. "You're a damn good surgeon, Victoria, but you're more than that. You're someone who knows what it means to fight for what's right, and that's something the world needs." Victoria felt something shift inside her, a sense of clarity she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel vulnerable. The weight of the decisions she had made, the sacrifices she had endured, all of it suddenly felt like a burden she could share. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not sure if I can go back." Mikhailova smiled, a small but knowing expression. "You don't have to go back. You just have to move forward, whatever that looks like." The words settled in, and for the first time in a long while, Victoria allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by the mistakes of her past. As she turned to leave the nurse's station, a sense of resolve began to take hold. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing tall, facing the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. And as the night shift began to settle in, Victoria knew that the next chapter of her life had already started. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were still many questions left unanswered. But she was done hiding. The decision was in her hands now. Later that night, as Victoria prepared to leave the hospital, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Colonel Davis. "I'll be waiting for your answer. When you're ready, we'll make it happen." Victoria stared at the screen for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. The offer was still on the table. The chance to return to the Navy, to create a program that would change the way the military and civilian medical communities interacted. It was everything she had ever wanted, but it also meant facing the past she had tried so hard to escape. She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the question. She could feel the weight of her decision, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like an opportunity, a chance to use everything she had learned in the field to apply it in a way that could make a real difference. "I'll think about it," she texted back. But this time, there was no hesitation in her response. She knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it head-on. The door to the hospital swung open as she stepped out into the cool night air, the stars shining brightly above. It felt like a new beginning, and for the first time in years, Victoria didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she was running towards something. The future was still uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer afraid to live in it. The morning after her conversation with Mikhailova, Victoria woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, the weight she had carried for years felt lighter. The uncertainty, the fear of exposure, the constant running, it all seemed less daunting now. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the shadows. She had to face her past to move forward, and for the first time, she was willing to do it. As she drove to the hospital, her mind kept returning to Colonel Davis's offer. He had made it clear that the Navy wanted her back, not as a temporary surgeon, not as someone who had been dishonorably discharged, but as someone who could make a difference. His offer to integrate military medical training with civilian practices had intrigued her from the moment he spoke it. She had always believed in the value of combat medicine, the quick thinking, the adaptability, the ability to save lives when the system was broken. And now, the opportunity to build something lasting, something that could change how medicine was practiced in both the military and civilian sectors, was right in front of her. As she parked her car and stepped out, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Davis. I'll be waiting for your answer. The simplicity of the message felt like an invitation, a challenge, a reminder that the decision was hers to make. The hospital was quieter in the early morning hours, the calm before the storm of the day's chaos. Victoria walked through the halls, her steps purposeful, but her mind still processing the enormity of the choice she faced. She had spent so long hiding behind her work, so long convincing herself that she wasn't worthy of the life she had once known. But now the walls she had built were starting to crumble. The past was still there, but it didn't have the power to define her anymore. She had a chance to redefine who she was. The door to her office opened, and she was greeted by Dr. Thornton. His usual stern expression softened when he saw her. "Dr. Ramirez," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying note of curiosity. "I heard you had a conversation with Colonel Davis." Victoria nodded, her hands resting on the desk in front of her. "I did." Thornton's eyes narrowed, as if he were trying to read her. "And?" he asked. Victoria took a deep breath. This was it, the moment where she would have to decide who she wanted to be. "I'm going to take the offer," she said simply. Thornton didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his gaze locked on her face. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Victoria met his gaze, feeling a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. "I'm sure." Thornton nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer, but the weight of his words still hung in the air. "You've got a lot of people questioning your past, Ramirez. You've got a lot of things to prove." Victoria's heart tightened, but she didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone," she said firmly. "I'm doing this for me, to make up for what I've lost, to use the skills I've developed in a way that matters." Thornton studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, his expression softening. "Good, then you've made the right choice." As Thornton left, Victoria felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had made her decision, and now it was time to face whatever came next. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer running. She had spent too long hiding from the past, too long afraid of what would happen if the truth came to light. But now the truth was hers to own. She had been through hell to get here, but she wasn't going to let that define her anymore. The door opened again, and this time it was Colonel Davis. He stepped inside, his expression a mixture of expectation and something else, something that felt almost like hope. "You made the decision," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. Victoria looked at him, feeling a sense of finality in her response. "I have," she said simply. "I'm in." Davis smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of recognition. "Good," he said. "I knew you would be." As he left, Victoria stood in the quiet of her office, the weight of the decision finally settling in. She had accepted the offer, but now she had to make it count. She had spent years running from the truth, but now she was going to face it head-on. She wasn't going to hide anymore. The phone on her desk buzzed again, this time with a text from Mikhailova. "Steele's recovering well. We're all watching." Victoria's fingers hovered over the phone, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had made a difference in Steele's life, and now she had the chance to make a difference in the lives of others. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Victoria Ramirez was back, and this time she wasn't going anywhere. As she stepped out of her office, the morning sun bathed the hospital in a soft golden light, the promise of a new day stretching out before her. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but she knew it would be a journey worth taking. She was no longer the woman who had run from her past. She was the woman who had decided to face it. And that, she realized, was all that mattered.